Life with my husband had become predictable. Our routines were comfortable, and although we weren't as passionate as we had been when we first met, I thought we were still solid. We lived in a cozy home, shared quiet evenings, and while we might not have been as close as we once were, I believed we were partners. We'd been through so much together, good and bad, and I was confident that we had a strong foundation. Mark, my husband's best friend, had always been part of our lives. I never thought much of it. He was a constant, a familiar face in our circle, and I trusted him completely. They had known each other for years, childhood friends who had been through everything together. I always appreciated the bond they shared. Mark was like family, someone I knew I could rely on if anything ever went wrong. He would stop by occasionally just to hang out or to catch up, and I never thought anything of it. I assumed it was normal, the way close friends behaved, and I welcomed his company because he made my husband happy. But recently I started feeling a strange undercurrent of tension that I couldn't quite place. It was subtle at first, small moments that seemed harmless enough, but when put together began to make me feel uneasy. I had always seen Mark as just my husband's friend, but now something felt different. He would glance at me a little longer than usual, or touch my arm a little too casually. At first I told myself I was overthinking it. It was probably just me being paranoid. After all, I trusted both of them, so why would I doubt them now? It wasn't just the way Mark looked at me, it was his presence. I noticed it more when we were all together. When my husband and I would talk, Mark would often interrupt, not in a rude way, but in a way that seemed like he was trying to assert some sort of dominance in our conversations. There were moments when I'd catch him staring at me, but when our eyes met, he'd quickly look away, as though he'd been caught. The tension was growing, but I wasn't sure if I should confront it or just let it go. I wondered if I was imagining things. Maybe it was just my own insecurities playing tricks on me, or perhaps I was feeling neglected in my marriage and looking for something that wasn't there. But even though I tried to push it out of my mind, there was this nagging feeling that I couldn't ignore. Things were changing, and I wasn't sure I liked it. Mark started acting differently around me, and at first I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I was just overanalyzing every little thing, but over time it became harder to deny. It wasn't anything huge or overt, but there were small, almost imperceptible shifts in the way he interacted with me. I'd catch him glancing at me in a way that felt a little too intense, like he was looking for something more than just a casual conversation. Sometimes when he'd talk to me, his gaze would linger a bit longer than usual, and his smile would feel almost too knowing. It was subtle, but I could sense the difference. It made me uncomfortable, though I didn't know exactly why. I told myself that maybe I was just imagining things after all. We'd all been friends for so long. Maybe I was reading too much into the moments that seemed off. But then there were other times when he'd touch me a little too deliberately, a hand on my shoulder that stayed a moment too long, or an arm brushing against mine when it didn't need to. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that he didn't mean anything by it, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. The worst part was that I couldn't tell my husband. If I told him how Mark had been acting, it would sound ridiculous, even to me. It was just my perception, wasn't it? A small touch here, a glance there, none of it meant anything, right? But I couldn't help feeling that there was a shift happening, a shift I couldn't ignore. I began to feel like I was walking on a tightrope, caught between not wanting to cause trouble and feeling like something wasn't quite right. Still, I tried to push it out of my mind. I didn't want to make things awkward, didn't want to ruin the friendship that had been part of our lives for so long. But the more time I spent around Mark, the harder it became to ignore the underlying tension between us. It wasn't just the way he acted, it was the way I began to feel in his presence. There was a growing pull between us, an unspoken connection that I couldn't explain. Every time we were together, I could feel it tightening. It wasn't like anything had happened, at least not yet, but there was a sense that something was building, something I wasn't sure I wanted to acknowledge. I tried to tell myself that I was overthinking it, that it was just me reading too much into innocent behavior. But deep down, I knew things were changing. I just didn't know where it was all headed. That night, when my husband was away on a business trip, Mark came over as usual. We had planned to just hang out, nothing special. I told myself it was going to be a normal evening, just two old friends catching up. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Mark had always been easygoing, never pushy, but there was an unmistakable energy between us now. As we sat on the couch, the space between us felt smaller, even though we hadn't physically moved any closer. We talked like we always did, but this time the conversation felt heavier, more intense. I couldn't pinpoint exactly why, but everything seemed charged. Every word, every gesture felt like it carried more meaning than it had before. He leaned in just a little closer when he spoke, his body angled toward mine in a way that felt almost intentional. I caught myself noticing the way he smelled, the warmth of his skin as he sat next to me. It was ridiculous, this was just Mark, my husband's friend, right? But every little thing seemed amplified. His eyes seemed to hold my attention in a way they never had, and it made me feel uneasy, but also drawn to him in a way I couldn't explain. I tried to ignore it, to push it to the back of my mind, but the tension was building with each passing moment. At one point, our knees brushed against each other. It was accidental, I told myself, but when I looked at him, I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen before, something more than friendship. I should have pulled away, should have gotten up and changed the subject, but instead, I stayed still, waiting to see what would happen next. It felt like the world was holding its breath, like everything had come to a standstill. Then, almost as if we were both waiting for the other to make the first move, he reached out and touched my arm. The contact was soft, but there was something deliberate about it. His fingers lingered on my skin, tracing a slow, almost thoughtful path along my arm. It was the kind of touch I had never expected from him, but in that moment, it didn't feel wrong. It felt like something I had been waiting for, even if I didn't fully understand why. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let the moment stretch between us, my heart racing in my chest as I tried to make sense of what was happening. And then, without warning, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine. It wasn't a kiss that happened suddenly, as if we were both caught off guard. It was a kiss that had been building for what felt like hours, maybe even longer. It was slow, hesitant at first, as though neither of us wanted to admit what was really happening, but once it started, I couldn't stop it. It felt like a secret we were both holding on to, something we both knew was wrong, but neither of us could resist. The guilt should have been there, but all I could feel was the heat of his body against mine, the need to be closer. I didn't stop him. And for that moment, I didn't want to. The next morning, I woke up with a feeling I couldn't shake, a heaviness that settled deep in my chest. It wasn't the kind of feeling you could ignore. It wasn't just a mistake or a fleeting moment, it felt like the weight of what I had done was already pressing down on me. I tried to go about my day like everything was normal, but it felt like I was walking through fog, disconnected from everything around me. The events of the previous night kept replaying in my mind, each moment flashing in vivid detail. His touch, the way his lips felt on mine, the way everything seemed to stop and tilt when we kissed. I hadn't expected to feel this way. I thought it would be something temporary, a brief lapse in judgment, but the guilt was suffocating. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about what had happened between us. Mark had been different since then, like he was unaffected, as though it was just another moment in time. But for me, it was everything. I couldn't look at him the same way, couldn't even think about our conversations without feeling that pang of regret. Every time I saw him, it was like there was this unspoken tension between us, a secret neither of us was willing to acknowledge but couldn't hide. When we interacted, it was almost as though he was treating me like nothing had changed. He was acting casual, even playful at times, but I could feel that it wasn't the same. I couldn't look at him without remembering how his touch had felt, how he had held me in a way I never imagined. I could still feel the warmth of his body next to mine, the way he had pulled me in. And the worst part was that I didn't know how to handle it. I wanted to avoid him, to ignore what had happened and pretend it didn't matter. But it did matter. The guilt was too strong to deny. It wasn't just about what I had done, it was about what it meant. I had betrayed my husband, and I didn't know how to come to terms with that. I had let someone else into my life in a way that no one ever should. It wasn't just the physical act that hurt, it was the emotional betrayal that cut deeper than I ever imagined. And now I couldn't escape the shame. Every time I saw Mark, every time I thought about what had happened, I felt like I was carrying a weight I couldn't bear. I didn't know how to face my husband or even how to face myself. The guilt was overwhelming, but the worst part was that I wasn't sure what to do about it. I couldn't undo what had been done. I had crossed a line and now there was no going back. It didn't take long for everything to unravel. The guilt that had been eating away at me had nowhere to hide anymore. I had been trying so hard to keep things normal, to pretend like nothing had changed, but the truth always finds its way to the surface. Mark wasn't making it easy. He acted as if nothing was different, but there was an unspoken tension between us now. Every time we interacted, I felt like I was walking a fine line, one wrong move away from everything spilling out. One afternoon, I was sitting at home when I got a message from Mark. It was casual, asking how I was doing, but something about it felt off. He wanted to talk. I knew what that meant. I could feel the air thickening around me, the quiet panic building in my chest. It was inevitable he was going to bring it up. We couldn't go on pretending. I couldn't ignore what had happened, and neither could he. When he arrived at my house, the silence between us was deafening. He didn't waste any time. "We need to talk," he said, and I could hear the seriousness in his voice. I tried to prepare myself, but nothing could have prepared me for what was coming. Mark didn't seem ashamed of what had happened between us. If anything, he seemed almost indifferent, as if it was just something that had occurred, something that didn't mean much in the grand scheme of things. And that only made me feel worse. I couldn't stop the flood of emotions that hit me all at once: anger, shame, confusion. I felt betrayed by him, and worse, I felt betrayed by myself. The guilt was suffocating. I had let it happen, had let myself fall into something I couldn't control. And now I was paying the price. Mark's presence in my life had always been something I took for granted, but now it was tainted. Our friendship, the trust I once had in him, had been shattered, and nothing would ever be the same. I knew I had to tell my husband. I couldn't avoid it anymore. The longer I kept the truth from him, the more it ate at me. But even as I prepared myself to confess, I felt like a part of me was already lost. The betrayal was there, hanging in the air, and I couldn't undo it. My husband would never look at me the same way again. He would never trust me the same way again. And that realization hurt more than anything. In the end, it wasn't just the affair that destroyed me, it was everything that followed. The guilt, the secrecy, the lies, it was all too much. I had betrayed not just my husband but myself, and I didn't know how to fix it. The damage had been done, and no amount of regret could change that.